They are some of the world's most notorious killers.
He enjoyed inflicting pain on people.
But were these psychopaths born evil, or did their mothers make them into monsters? I'm Donal McIntyre, and I'm on a quest to explore how some of history's most notorious murderers were moulded by their relationships with their mother.
When you've got somebody who has been described as the mother from hell, that's not going to be an easy relationship for the child and the parent.
I'll be piecing together events from their childhood and talking to criminologists and psychologists to try and understand what motivated their monstrous crimes.
53 stab wounds is beyond what I've experienced in my career.
In this episode, Mark Howe grew up in a loving family with a mother and sister who doted over him. But as he reached his teens, he became increasingly withdrawn, spending all of his time in his bedroom. He developed an increasing anger and resentment towards his mother, which would eventually boil over into murderous rage. But what part did his mother play in turning him into the man who would kill her? Mothers are the ones who bring us into this world, and for most of us, they're the people who have the greatest influence on our childhood. And so it's hard to fathom how anyone would want to intentionally murder their own mother. And yet here in Leicester, in 2013, that's exactly what happened. In the summer of that year, this quiet community near the centre of Leicester was rocked by a brutal and savage murder. Mother of two, Tina Wardle, was viciously stabbed to death as she lay in her own bed. The killer, her own son, 21-year-old Mark Howe.
It was a vicious and sustained knife attack.
It's absolutely horrific. The judge actually referred to it as almost like torture.
It was like he was possessed by a black rage or something.
I've come to Leicester to find out what drove Mark Howe to commit this horrific murder. Why did he harbour such hatred towards his mother? And what made him decide he wanted her dead? Mark Howe was born to his mother Tina in 1992. But when he was a baby, his parents broke up, leaving Tina to bring up him and his sister Anne all alone. Despite Tina being a single parent, the children weren't lacking in any affection. She doted on her blue-eyed baby. He was the apple of her eye.
She worked very hard as a cleaner, and she was really struggling to make ends meet. And everybody that I spoke to that knew her said she was a woman with an absolute heart of gold.
She was always happy, a smile on her face. I'd never seen her without a smile. And she was just bubbly. And she was a good mum. She loved her kids, and I think she would have done anything for them.
For all intents and purposes, it seemed like they had a happy childhood. However, he did have this lonesome, isolated character that was quite evident from a very young age.
With her husband no longer on the scene, Tina raised her two children as best she could. But she had had a difficult upbringing herself, and as a result, it seems she struggled to set boundaries for her son from an early age. Nevertheless, it appears Mark and his older sister had a happy childhood. However, when Mark started school, he found it difficult to form friendships with his peers. He was bullied by the other children and became a bit of a loner in the playground. And it was clear that Tina knew all about it.
She would talk to her friends, she would talk to her work colleagues, she would talk to people in her life about his behaviour and how much it concerned her and worried her.
Despite Tina's worries about how he was getting on at school, she continued to try and make sure that Mark was happy at home. And when a new man called Chris came into her life, she hoped it would give her family the extra support she thought it needed. But instead, it's possible that Chris's arrival may have upset the existing family dynamic.
His mum's affections were purely on him and his sister. At that point, a new man comes into their life, and suddenly his mother's affections and love is not just directed at him.
By the time Mark Howe was 13 years old, Tina had begun to spend periods of time away from home to visit Chris, leaving her children to look after themselves. Tina and Chris's relationship flourished, and in 2006, they decided to move in together.
They weren't well off. They lived in a small flat in a council estate in Leicester, but they made the best of things, and Tina tried her level best to have a normal life for herself, for Chris and for Mark.
She thought that moving in with Chris would be a new start for her son, a chance to build new friendships and to feel part of a family. But it seems that Mark didn't appreciate the new dynamic.
He was probably feeling a bit like the man of the house. You know, he was the man, had his mum and his sister, and then suddenly a man does come into the house. So there might have been some growing resentment there.
Frustrated, he began to harbour feelings of anger towards his mother.
Rather than focusing that on his stepfather, he's focusing on his mother, because his mother is the one that should be there to protect him and adore him and love him. So he starts to feel anger and bitterness against her.
Tina soon realised that the move to Leicester to live with Chris had not brought Mark out of his shell as she'd hoped. On the contrary, she noticed he'd begun to isolate himself from the rest of the family, locking himself away in his bedroom and spending hours on his computer. Alone in his online world, Mark spent more and more of his time playing graphically violent video games.
Video games and internet life for him were everything. There was very little real-world activity to balance his online activity. And clearly in Howe's case, he wasn't doing anything else in life that made him feel good about himself. So the only thing he had that made him feel better about who he was the video games.
There is significant research now that has shown that constant exposure to violent video games has the capacity to affect the individual's ability to be able to empathise.
It desensitises you to violence, so it becomes less shocking. So it doesn't make a non-violent person violent. However, it creates a situation where violence isn't as shocking to an individual.
As Mark Howe became increasingly immersed in his online world, it seems he was becoming more and more comfortable with extreme violence. Despite having a loving childhood, Mark Howe developed into a withdrawn teenager, obsessed with violent video games. But what turned this young man against his mother? I'm meeting criminologist Dr. Elizabeth Yardley to find out what she thinks might have been the root cause of Mark Howe's resentment. So the landscape now is a broken home, but a hugely committed, if not overly committed mother, a young boy, blue-eyed boy, doted on by mother and sister, and that is not an unusual dynamic.
No, it's not. She's a single parent, she's the head of a household. This is something that is incredibly common in society today. This isn't a family that is screaming out any warning signals. This is a family that is just ticking along. They're not on the radar of social services, they're not attracting the attention of the police, they're not the type of family who the state basically keep an eye on, are they?
Liz, we have the blue-eyed boy, and in comes into the scene the stepfather, Chris.
And this is quite a change in the family dynamic, isn't it? Because for many years, it's just been the three of them. It's just been him and his mum and his sister. And now there's another male figure in the household. So I think this is quite a change for him to adapt to.
This new relationship and dynamic seems to have been accommodated reasonably well, but I think you'd be naive to think that there wasn't some sense of resentment or that the new stepdad wasn't perceived as some kind of threat.
Well, there will be in the early days, because this is a change to your family dynamic. There's an individual coming into your household who hasn't been there before. But the impression that I get from this family is that transition would have been managed quite smoothly. It wouldn't have been he moved in overnight. It would have been something that was perhaps introduced as something that might be a possibility, and it would have been dealt with quite sensitively. But still, I think it would have been quite a thing for this young lad who's been used to having his mum and his sister all to himself for 10 years.
This is a key case in point where it's difficult to distinguish a normal teenager from a teenager who is about to commit a very dangerous crime.
It is really difficult, because when you look at the behaviour of teenagers, often, you know, when you look at specific things that they do, you see them in cases like this. But I think the important thing for me when we're looking at this case is that sense of withdrawal, that sense of isolation. And teens will want to spend at least some time with their peer group, and that's not what's going on here.
In 2013, 21-year-old Mark Howe murdered his mother, Tina, in cold blood. Tina was a single mother who had tried to give Mark a childhood full of love and affection. But bringing her new partner, Chris, into the family made Mark resent her. When she and Chris decided to move in together, Tina took Mark with her. But in the new family home, Mark once again locked himself away in his room with his computer for hours on end. Mark Howe's obsession with video games began to grow throughout his teenage years. With no friends to speak of, he'd spend hours and hours playing games with people he'd met online. Growing increasingly withdrawn from the real world, when he did venture outside, he'd come and go without saying so much as a single word to his mother.
He was living in a virtual fantasy world on his computer, and his make-believe world was far more important than reality.
He wouldn't mix, he wouldn't talk. I saw him in town, walking from town, and I waved at Chris and Tina, they waved, but he just put his head down. He didn't want to communicate with anybody.
By the time Mark was 17, his conduct was of such concern that his mother decided she had to take action. Together with her partner, Chris, she brought him to a doctor to see if she could get an official diagnosis that might explain his unusual behaviour.
They wanted to see if there was a medical, a psychological, or a physiological reason for why he trapped himself in his bedroom and wouldn't engage with the real world. Unfortunately for all of them, that assessment didn't result in any further diagnosis or support, and they were back to square one again with Howe being in his room, being antisocial.
Mark went back to sealing himself off in his room and playing violent video games against friends he'd made online. People he'd never actually met in real life. More concerned than ever, his mother and her boyfriend would make one last-ditch attempt to tear him away and get him to engage with his family. In 2011, Tina's partner Chris asked her to marry him. Chris had always been part of Mark's life since he and Tina first met some years earlier, but they were never especially close. Seeing an opportunity to connect with Mark and to tighten the new family bond, Chris asked Mark to be his best man.
The wedding was a special day for them both, and he was Chris's best man. He brought him into that. And he stood there, but he never spoke.
But far from living happily ever after, this would be the beginning of a family tragedy. After the wedding, Mark quickly went back to shutting himself away in his room to play violent video games with his online friends. While spending hours locked away in his own bedroom, he soon developed a troubling drug habit, which would send him deeper and deeper into a fantasy world.
His use of drugs may well have aided him in protecting himself from the painful reality of what he was struggling with. And certainly they would have enhanced his withdrawal into the fantasy world and the cyber world.
His mother and stepfather said that they could hear him screaming and shouting and swearing from his bedroom. He's so heavily involved in the virtual online world, but not involved at all in the real world.
By now, Tina was at the end of her tether. She felt she had tried everything to put a stop to his sullen and difficult behaviour, and she finally decided to challenge him over his drug habit.
There was an ongoing row about his use of cannabis, and it was a bone of contention, and Mark was really resentful of his mother's criticism about it.
For Howe, this perceived intrusion into his secret world was more than he could bear, and it only served to escalate the anger and resentment that he felt towards his mother.
He's getting angry at his mother. How dare you tell me what to do? He starts screaming at her. He starts becoming very aggressive towards her. So he's putting all that blame on her.
The more that his mother pestered him and bothered him and tried to get him to straighten out, the more annoying and frustrating he would have found that, and the more disagreeable he would have found her company.
Howe was a young man living in a world of virtual warfare, and Tina had just made herself enemy number one. He decided to vent his fury against his mother in the only place he felt he could, on the internet.
He went on to tell Facebook friends that he'd never met, that he thought that she was a whore and a slag and how much he detested her. And there didn't seem to be any real reason for why he hated her so much.
There's no evidence to say she's done anything to deserve this. It's just this is a young man who feels angry, and the target of his anger is his mother.
At the same time as developing a deep-rooted hatred towards his mother, he also began to cultivate extremely disturbing interests.
Mark was obsessed with a fictional TV character who was a police worker and had a fantasy lifestyle of seeking revenge and killing people for retribution using knives.
He would converse with his internet chat and WhatsApp to friends about these shows, about how he wanted to be the kind of protagonist villain. He'd almost fallen into the trap of what you sometimes see with lonely adolescent men, where they fixate upon and idolise a particular character.
Mark Howe was becoming increasingly obsessed with his favourite television serial killer. So infatuated was he with the idea of adopting a new persona that in October 2012, he applied to change his name by deed poll.
There was clearly a need to want to give birth to a new self with a different name, so that he was ostensibly the parent to his own self, eliminating his own parents.
In changing his name, Mark was rejecting Tina. It must have been extremely hurtful to her as a mother.
Mark changed his name to Spike Lug.
We're not quite sure where the origin of that comes from, but it seems to be that it's the similarities to friends that he's met online. Maybe it's got something to do with this character on a TV series. Whatever it is, it symbolises this removal from reality, about him becoming almost like a character.
When Tina saw on Facebook that Mark had changed his name, she left a message on his page.
His mother made a comment, "You will always be Mark to me."
She, at this point, she's desperately scared that she's losing her son. She can see him slowly kind of falling away from her. And at the point that he's changing his whole identity, it's almost like she's lost him at that point.
His reaction to that was both to be really very derogatory about his mother to his friends and to block her on this social media platform.
Once again, Mark felt that Tina was invading his private world. And once again, he chose to shut her out. And alone in his room, playing violent video games and smoking cannabis, Mark had developed a new obsession: knives. He even went as far as researching the knives and other weapons used by his favourite TV serial killer.
The serial killer in the television series famously has a kill bag, which is a collection of weapons all designed for carrying out these serial killing attacks that he was famous for. Mark had searched for that kill bag. There were different pictures on his computer of the kill bag, some descriptions of it and what a kill bag should contain.
Alone in his room, armed with a knife taken from the kitchen, he would stab everything he could see: his wall, his punch bag, his door. The violence, it seems, had progressed from the virtual to the real world.
He was clearly fantasizing, going through the motions of stabbing and killing somebody. And this again was a natural progression from his thinking, his feeling, through to his doing.
It is quite a scary tipping point, that, because it is where the virtual world is stepping into the real world in some way, that he's making almost steps to how his online identity is actually going to be realised in real life.
By late 2012, Mark, the once gentle blue-eyed boy, pampered by his adoring mother, had become a monster. Trapped in a world of drugs, violent video games, and TV serial killers, his fragile grip on reality began to slip. I want to find out what Dr. Liz Yardley thinks was going through Mark Howe's mind as he shut himself away in his room. We've seen a growing isolation by him, a withdrawal from the real world, and at the same time, a growing antipathy towards his mother. Why?
Well, his world, his social world, is quite a small one. The number of people that he has face-to-face contact with is incredibly small. So when he is coming to kind of externalise that rage and to vent it, the people who are going to feel the brunt of that are those that are closest to him, and that's going to be focused on his mother.
It would appear to me that he still hasn't forgiven her for bringing a new man in the house.
I don't think it's that. I think it's the fact that he's aware that she's invested so much emotionally in him that for him to basically give her a hard time and have a go at her, it's going to have much more of an impact on his mother than his stepfather. So he's targeting the person to whom he's going to do the most damage, basically.
And he's quite explicit about doing damage to his mother and graphically abusing her online to his friends.
Yeah, he has conversations with his online friends in which he describes in quite graphic detail, you know, what he's going to do to his mother. He openly calls her a whore and a bitch and really horrible things like that. So he's being incredibly vocal. This is somebody who's internalised for quite a significant period of time, and now he's got this new space in which he can externalise, he can share his thoughts and his feelings, and he really is running with it.
So he's trying to reconstruct his presentation to the world and actually makes an effort to actually change his own name.
He does, and this is quite important, I think, because our names say a lot about us. They embody our identities. They're how we're known to the rest of the world. And the fact that he's changing his name from something that's different to his family name is quite an insult to his family. It's a kind of separation from them in a way.
And we understand that at one stage he changed his profile and he kind of renounced his mother, but his mother goes online and says, "You'll always be my son, you'll always be Mark to me."
And isn't that absolutely embarrassing for a teenager who's trying to communicate a sense of their adult identity online, to have your mother come into that space and embarrass you and humiliate you? And he's going to feel quite enraged about that.
In July 2013 in Leicester, Mark Howe stabbed his own mother to death in a frenzied attack. Tina had tried to raise her son with love and affection, but as he grew older, he began to develop a burning hatred and resentment towards her for what he perceived to be her constant intrusions into his life. Alone in his room, he'd created an online universe saturated with violent video games and murderous TV shows. In the quest to create a new persona for himself, he'd even changed his name by deed poll. In January 2013, Mark and his mother Tina clashed again. Increasingly concerned by his bizarre behaviour around the home, Tina was pushed to breaking point. But Mark, furious at what he saw as his mother's constant interventions, had reached a breaking point of his own. But this time, instead of going to his room and directing his rage towards his punchbag and door, he went online and formulated a plan to kill.
He's obviously at that point, whether he's planning on doing something imminently, it's taking it from a level where he's playing violent video games, but now actually seeking what weapon is best to use if you are going to harm somebody. So there's certainly a change in his behaviour from a virtual world to actually seeming to plan how he would hurt somebody.
We see that Howe's messages about his fantasies, about him developing this badass personality, become more violent. The language is more about doing people, calling people terrible names, why they must die, justifying what will be a fatal action.
By 2013, Mark's obsession with murder permeated every aspect of his life. He also exhibited open and persistent hostility towards his mother. However, outside of the home and away from his mother, Mark Howe had found himself a job in a care home. And although at home he had developed an online persona based on violence and murder, in the outside world, he appeared on the surface to be a completely normal young man.
Mark Howe was almost two personalities. His colleagues would have said that he was very introverted, and yet they would say that the way he dealt with the residents at the care home was an entirely different way to the way that he interacted with people who were his colleagues.
He could engage with the residents really well. So he was showing a caring side and empathy towards the people that were in difficulty in the care home.
But Mark Howe left this caring side to his character at work every day. And by the time he arrived home, he'd once again adopted his sinister online alter ego, filled with murderous rage against his mother. On the morning of the 15th of July, 2013, Mark Howe's stepdad, Chris, set off for a couple of days away for work, leaving Mark and his mother alone in the house. That day he went to work as normal, finishing his shift at the care home at around 3 o'clock. On his way home, he popped in to get some food and a small bottle of vodka at a local store. Tina had also gone to work, returning home at about 8:20. Meanwhile, Howe spent his time in the same way he did every other evening.
He told us that he had spent the time in his room, he had watched some television, played some games.
Between 10 p.m. and midnight, it's believed Mark cooked himself some dinner and then went back to his room to eat it, consuming some of the vodka he'd purchased earlier on. Nothing appears to have been out of the ordinary. But for years, Mark had been slowly descending into a pit of hatred towards his mother. On this particular night, for reasons that have never been established, the anger he'd been harbouring towards her was about to boil over. And Howe made a cry for help to the only people he felt close to, his online friends.
He messages a friend around about midnight saying he really needs to talk. So this shows that he was at this point desperate to talk to somebody.
Mark's attempt to engage with somebody indicates that he was in some turmoil in his own mind. It was an attempt at seeking an intervention that might have made a difference.
He was reaching out, and it's quite frustrating to think what could have happened if at that point he did have somebody to reach out to.
With no one to talk to, Howe finally had reached a tipping point. In the early hours of July 16th, 2013, after years alone in his bedroom and months of growing resentment towards his mother, he decided that time had come to kill her.
What appears to have happened is that at some point in the early hours of the 13th of July, Mark Howe comes into that room, armed with the knife we believe to be the weapon that he uses to kill her.
It looks like his mother is either asleep in bed or about to go to bed because she's dressed just in her underwear and that's how she sleeps.
Tina was entirely vulnerable, and he stabs Tina repeatedly.
He stabbed her in the face, he stabbed her in the mouth and the chest, and it was relentless. It was a frenzied, bloody attack.
We had two witnesses. Both of them heard screams. One of them heard Tina pleading to not do whatever it was that was happening at the time. Tina must have been absolutely terrified.
Some experts believe that this murder was purely opportunistic, but I think Mark Howe had planned to kill his mother for some time. I'm meeting Dr. Liz Yardley to find out whether she agrees. Liz, this for me has all the signs of a premeditated and planned murder, particularly in relation to the absence of the stepdad.
I think that this absolutely was premeditated. His stepfather was away on a planned trip. He knew that he'd be away. He knew that he'd be in the home alone with his mother. So what he's got here is opportunity.
He did a little bit of drinking, we know, certainly smoking cannabis, and at 2 o'clock in the morning he committed a frenzied attack on his own mother and crucially stabs her in the face.
This was incredibly vicious. She had something like 53 stab wounds. This was a sustained attack, which would have taken some time to actually complete. And it's much more violence than you need to end somebody's life. And when you look at where some of the wounds were, they were on her face, on her neck, she had defensive wounds. It really would have been the most horrendous situation in which she really was fighting for her life. But the thing that really does stand out for me, he had opportunities to stop what he was doing. He had many, many chances to say, okay, I'm not going to carry on with this, but he chose to continue. And it really is something that is incredibly violent, but it's incredibly planned. I think that the mistake that we shouldn't make here is to think that he's just snapped, he's just lost it. He hasn't. He knows exactly what he's doing, and he knows it's wrong.
In 2013, 21-year-old Mark Howe murdered his own mother. In a vicious attack, he stabbed her 53 times before leaving her to bleed to death. For months, he'd been obsessed with the idea of killing. Now he really had become a murderer, and the first thing he decided to do was to tell one of his online friends, someone he'd never actually met in person, about what he'd done.
He sent a WhatsApp message to a friend he had met online saying, "I have killed my mother." And the friend, quite frankly, did not believe him. And so to convince him, he sent him a photograph of his blood-stained shoes.
With his mother still bleeding to death, Howe then took a shower, packed some clothes into a bag, and left his home. Using his mother's bank card, he withdrew cash from her account. He then walked a short distance to this petrol station and bought some cigarettes. All the while, blood dripped from the wounds he sustained as he stabbed his mother to death.
He's injured his hands so that on one hand the webbing between the thumb and the finger is quite severely cut. Our opinion of that is, in a 53 stab wound frenzied attack, his hand has slipped down the knife.
Although inside the home, Howe had become Spike Luck, the vicious killer. When he emerged back into the outside world, it appears he didn't know what to do with himself. First, he headed to a McDonald's in the city centre in order to clean his hands, which were still bleeding from the attack. Then Howe made his way to Leicester train station, where he bought a one-way ticket to Derbyshire, where his sister lived.
He was talking to his sister on the phone. He wanted to go and see her in Chesterfield, but at that time there was no trains running. So he went to a care home that he worked at.
It took Howe 40 minutes to walk the 2 miles from Leicester station to the care home. During that time, he seems to have come up with a story to explain the injury to his hand.
He told a member of staff that his stepfather had attacked him to explain the blood on his hands and his condition that he was in.
At the same time, he takes the opportunity to change some of his clothes, which are now blood-stained, and one of the care home staff helps him to put some form of bandage onto his hand to help with the bleeding. He's then collected a short time later by a taxi. The taxi does take him and deposit him at the train station. He again waits at the train station for a short while. His own account is that he realised that his train wasn't at least another hour, so he then chose to walk out of the city, this time to the other care home that he worked at.
As Howe walked to the second care home, he repeatedly made phone calls to his sister. At some point during their conversation, he admitted to killing someone, although he wouldn't say who. Howe arrived here at his second care home at 7 a.m. Despite having already admitted murder to his sister and a friend he'd met online, he still protested his innocence to his colleagues. But Howe was pale and visibly shaken. He had scratches and cuts to his hand, and his shoes were covered in blood. Realising that something was clearly wrong, one of the members of staff decided that her daughter, who also worked at the home, might have more luck getting him to talk.
For the next few minutes, she has a conversation trying to tease out of Mark what's happened, and essentially gets from him that he has hurt his mother.
Howe's colleague was naturally taken aback and suggested they call the police. Howe agreed and made no attempt to flee.
He eventually calls his sister again and confesses to what he did. And when the police finally arrive to the care home, when staff have called for help, he doesn't resist, he doesn't try and put up a struggle.
He went outside and was pacing up and down. I just think the reality of the awfulness of what he had done was just starting to sink in.
When the police arrived, he was found standing calmly outside the care home having a cigarette. Confused but compliant, the police arrested him for the murder of his mother, handcuffed him and took him to the station.
Mark came across in interview as very flat. He gave us an account. The account was verifiable all the way up to the time when he says he can't remember and then comes to his senses in the bathroom, looks back and realises that his mother is laying on the floor in the bedroom. My view was that that was a construct. I didn't believe him.
On the 14th of January 2014, Mark Howe was tried here at Leicester Crown Court for the murder of his mother. Her family, having been denied closure up to this point, were hopeful that Mark would be able to provide the answers they so desperately craved. However, in the dock, he remained calm and emotionless.
He was a very quiet-looking, unassuming young man. You would never dream, looking at him, that he was capable of such an atrocity.
In court, even when faced with all the evidence of his brutal crime, Mark Howe maintained that he couldn't remember actually killing his mother.
For Howe to actually think and remember killing his own mum and reliving what he did would be a psychological suicide bid. It will be so dark and disturbing for him to actually think through what he did that it could damage him for a very, very long time.
His mind needed to protect himself from the enormity of that part of his own functioning that could commit such a crime in such a savage way, because that would have been traumatic to him.
It's easier for his self-preservation just to box it off, compartmentalise it as something that must have happened and put it over there and not deal with it.
Mark Howe was evaluated by a team of psychiatrists, but they found that his claim of memory loss was extremely unlikely to be true. The judge threw out Howe's claim to have suffered from amnesia. Mr. Justice Haddon Cave said that although Howe may have only decided to kill his mother on the night in question, he'd been harbouring murderous thoughts for some time and allowed them to fester. In the eyes of the court, the murder was planned, calculated and committed in cold blood.
He was given a tariff of 21.5 years, and to be clear about that, there is a sentence discount to be applied at all stages through the court process. Mark Howe made his admission at the very latest stage that he could have done, but he was still entitled to a discount. The judge rejected it.
The judge said one can only imagine the horror of the realisation of what was being done to her by her own son. He had left his mother to just bleed to death by herself, all alone, on the floor, in the middle of the night.
He never moved, he just sat there staring straight at the judge. Not even cried when he got his sentenced or anything. It looked like he couldn't care less.
Mark Howe had a happy childhood full of love and affection. But despite the efforts of his mother and stepfather to get him to engage in family life, he grew up into a sullen, angry teenager obsessed with violence. Was Mark Howe a born killer? Or was there something in his relationship with his mother that turned him into her murderer? Liz, what kind of mother was Tina?
Well, I'd say that in Mark's early years, she was an Uber mother. She was trying to kind of overcompensate for the fact that she was on her own with the kids, that they didn't have a lot of money, and would shower them with love and affection. I think in later years, she develops more into a passive mother, in that she's hoping that this behaviour that Mark is displaying is going to go away, and that by doing less, she's not going to aggravate him.
What could she have done differently?
I'm not sure that she could have really done anything all that differently. And I think she was doing all of the right things. I think when it starts to get concerning is when he's entering his teenage years and when he's becoming more difficult to challenge, because physically he's bigger, he's got quite an attitude at the time, and actually there's a tendency to want to just keep the peace in the household, and I think that's when those opportunities for intervention were potentially missed.
In the aftermath of the murder, he appears to contact his sister for support and then contact his online friend for credit.
Yeah, and this would seem to be completely at odds, wouldn't it? And his relationship he's got with his online friend is the one that he's been trying to basically maintain and say, look at me, look at what I'm capable of, look at what a violent individual I am. And he wants to take the credit for having killed his mother, but at the same time he doesn't want to accept responsibility for it. So he's saying, yes, I've done it, but I can't remember it.
His defence is quite interesting for me because he's gone for the amnesia defence, and we've seen in other cases very similar to this that he's just gone straight on and blamed the mother and his upbringing for the crime. But he doesn't take that choice. He goes for amnesia.
Yeah, because it's just a blanket approach, isn't it? It basically deals with a lot of the things that people might come back to him with, those critical questions that he's going to face from the police and his wider family. By saying I don't remember any of it, he doesn't have to confront any of the challenges that he would get otherwise.
Mark Howe will spend at least 21.5 years in prison for the savage murder of his mother. But for those who are close to her, Tina can never be replaced.
Tina was described as the salt of the earth. She absolutely did not deserve anything bad to happen to her at all. She was only 48. She never lived to celebrate her 50th birthday. She had her whole life ahead of her.
It shook us, and I went to work and we're just all dumbfounded. I just couldn't believe he'd do that to his mum.